what are some ways in which people project their understanding of a Christian God and Christian values and morals and beliefs onto the Irish goddess Morrigan? This is a great question that we got from our Morrigan members community, which I have a whole section in there, which is an AMA, Ask Me Anything. But these are really common questions as well that we get, that I have gotten many times over the years, have answered in maybe different ways or as part of other videos. So I wanted to just pull it out here, make sure that they're available for everybody in our community at the Irish Pagan School. But the Morrigan Academy is where you can go if you want to have your own specific questions asked and answered by me in this process. So there's a link to all that below. But meanwhile, the blending of Christian perspectives with the ancient Irish pantheon is actually really common in Ireland. We had this whole centuries of just this cultural and religious evolution here on the island, and Irish paganism, not so much the paganism specifically, but certainly the Irish traditions, the Irish culture, is very much this syncretic blend of pagan and Christian traditions. And there are a lot of native or pre-Christian threads to this native spirituality that are still very evident through our ostensibly Christian practices here in Ireland. Now, this is a fascinating area of study. I'm not aware of anybody who has specifically looked at the Morrigan in this context from an academic perspective, but we'll give it a go here. So this synthesis or syncretism results from the Christianization process and is common, obviously, not just in Ireland, but like throughout the world, everywhere that Christianity has colonized, really. So we do see it in Ireland and beyond our borders, obviously, and our shores on this island, that pre-Christian deities would have been either demonized, diminished, or, assimilated into Christian narratives. And we see it in our own mythology, such as Lora, the Book of Invasions, or the Book of the Taking of Ireland, where you have Christian narratives which are obviously blended with earlier native beliefs, right? Through this whole process of telling these stories and in these tales. So all of this would have been to facilitate this transition to the new religion. This colonization of the new religion would subsume what was there already, would make familiar points and familiar aspects and familiar figures a part of their own new religion. So that's a well understood phenomenon that Christianity has been doing for many, many centuries, if not millennia. So the Morrigan, of course, is a complex deity associated with war, prophecy, sovereignty, magic, and fate. And there is this compelling, really, example of this phenomenon here within this particular tiny little microcosm case study, right? So some of the ways that Christian understandings have been projected onto the Morrigan that I still see to this day, right? So moral dualism. The Christian worldview is very black and white, really, in a lot of ways, right? It often categorizes entities or situations or anybody or anything really as inherently good or evil. You've got this absolute dichotomy between good and evil, and it really doesn't align with the Irish gods and goddesses, The Morrigan particularly embodies aspects of protection, prophecy, death, and really operates beyond simple moral binaries. And, even when the Morrigan is portrayed as a war goddess and, engaging in battles, there are still these wait a minute, whose side is she on? There's no kind of clear on this side, on that side, because the Morrigan and her sisters could be kind of fighting for or against anybody really at any given time through the mythologies, right? And again, even the reasoning for, like, if she's taken the Ulster side, is that because Maeve is the quote unquote bad guy, Maeve is the one who's often made out to be the antagonist really in that story, and Cuchulainn is the big hero. But there's so many different layers and there's so much complexity to all of that it's really, really not that simple. So this kind of black and white duality of good or evil really doesn't fit with Irish mythology generally, but particularly with the Morrigan. So, unfortunately, Christian interpretations, and let's be very aware that anybody Irish has grown up immersed in this Christian interpretations and Christian worldview, and certainly anybody who was raised within Christian Protestantism, Catholicism, anything like that throughout the whole world, has been immersed in all of these beliefs and this kind of standard way of thinking. So even if you think that, well, I don't have that bias, you do, right? You do. If you were raised within a Christian culture or even a Christian family or household, you do. That is in there, right? It is up to each of us to become aware of when those biases are being made present or coloring or, trying to project themselves onto our readings or our understandings or our relationships with the Morrigan or any of the Irish gods and goddesses. That's on us, right? But they are actually there. So please don't fool yourself that they're not, if that is a situation that you were, raised in. So anyway, these interpretations have often reduced this multifaceted character of the Morrigan to a more dualistic framework, particularly aligning her to the evil side of things, obviously. But there are also examples where she has been sanitized into, oh, she's helping Cuchulainn, she's his protector, she's his guardian angel. I've actually seen somebody call the Morrigan Cuchulainn's guardian angel, and that is not it, people. That is not what's happening in that story. So we need to just drop that and look at the mythology as much as we can with our own biases, not creating that filter, right? So demonization, we mentioned it already, but we're going to talk about it again. So in that Christianization process, many pagan gods, not just the Morrigan obviously, but many pagan gods and goddesses were recast as demons or evil spirits in Christian lore, or in the ostensibly pagan lore that was being written down in Christian times, right? So the Morrigan, with her connections to war and death, was particularly susceptible to this reinterpretation, of course. So her portrayal in some of the later medieval texts really reflects this demonization process, and even the glossaries and stuff like that, where her character or her role is being explained as in almost a dictionary definition, or like the the medieval equivalent of encyclopedias would be the glosses or the glossaries. And that was very much, the demonization was very much evident within those situations. So her role as sovereign or protector is overshadowed by a focus on her more fearsome aspects. So that was very common. Now, saintly transformations, this would be very, very common with, say, Bríd or Bridget. And we've other videos on the channel. We've got classes at the Irish Pagan School that explore this duality of nature between Christian and pagan with goddess and saint Bridget. But this is another way that Christian understanding has been projected onto the Morrigan. So while we don't specifically see evidence historically maybe of a saint who has been associated with the Morrigan, similar processes, as I said, have occurred with other deities within the Irish pantheon, and this blending serves to Christianize the attributes of the deity and aligns their stories and their significance. So while there's no specific saint connection with the Morrigan, that whole kind of vibe, that whole process has definitely happened in some cases. And those Christian values and narratives would have been put through those stories where they wouldn't have been there originally, right? Allegorical interpretations is another way. So some Christian interpretations have really sought to understand the Morrigan and other deities allegorically. So not as real, beings with their own agenda and, their own minds, all the rest of it, their own workings, their own lives, really, whether in this world or the other world, but has kind of tried to categorize them as representations of natural forces, human emotions, moral lessons, rather than as beings, as I said, with agency and divinity in their own right. And this is really, really common in neo-paganism. Again, not just with the Morrigan, but I have seen it so many times. And if you've ever tried to classify the Morrigan as like maiden, mother, or crone, or some kind of like psychological, and like, so I use archetypes, right? But there is a certain grouping or a certain inclination within neo-paganism to almost go back the way to reverse the process of archetypes. So in my view, archetypes are what deities would develop from within certain cultures, right? But within this kind of neo-pagan process, which is very heavily influenced by these Christian allegorical interpretations, what we see is it going back the way. So these fully formed, fully fledged, complete, like, they have their own agency. They are divine. They are gods and goddesses, but they are minimized then into archetypal situations, such as maiden, mother, and crone, such as the dark goddess, and kind of all blended together where they really have their own specific lives. Let's just, say what it is. So this approach really fits with the Christian worldview or the theological framework where there is one God, right? And even though you're calling it paganism, even if it might be a god and a goddess, reducing individual deities, particularly, I mean, maybe it's just maybe it's just me because I have a bias here towards the Irish gods and goddesses, but the Irish pantheon is so complex, like, and they are so far from, being aligned even with each other, like, that it's farcical to try and think that they could be just, our our interpretations of this kind of one true god or one true goddess, right? So most pagans who believe this don't understand that this is coming from this Christian allegorical interpretation, but that's really where I would put it back to, right? So the supremacy of a single deity, and viewing other gods, other goddesses, or other spiritual entities as symbolic. So, whether that's the one true Christian God or whether it is this kind of duality of God and goddess, you still have that kind of mindset of, well, everything else is symbolic. So the Morrigan is just a symbol. The Morrigan is just a symbol of human emotion, or the Morrigan is just, a representation of our fears or anything. Fuck off. Morrigan is way more than any of that, right? So anyway, that one particularly gets me, clearly. I've been dealing with that since I was 18 years old. And people trying to fight me tooth and nail that the gods aren't really real, You can believe in what you want to believe in, but it's just your brain experiencing, and formalizing and representing what you need, deep down. So no, don't buy that. Anyway, Virgin Mary parallels, right? So again, in some instances, pagan goddesses or the attributes of pagan goddesses have been absorbed into this Christian figure of the Virgin Mary. Now, Virgin Mary is very, very strong figure here in Ireland. So I really see this for anybody who has specifically grown up within this Catholic environment. So not just in Ireland, there are other cultures worldwide, obviously, that have very strong Catholic situations, and cultural steeping that the people would have grown up in. And the Virgin Mary then is a very strong part of that. Now, this kind of, like the Morrigan's characteristics are quite distinct from those traditionally associated with Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? But this general process of syncretism sometimes sees those nurturing, protective aspects of goddesses being mirrored in Mary's veneration, right? So if you grew up in, as I said, a Catholic environment where Mary was very prevalent, then you might find yourself relating to the Morrigan as a mother ring, very feminine. And this is before we even get into like sexualization or anything. I don't actually put that down to the Catholic side of things. It's another misrepresentation of the Morrigan, but I think it's more to do with either Christian repression of sexuality, and then the Morrigan becomes a point of freedom in that way. So the Morrigan becomes uber sexy suddenly, and they're very, very invested in the Morrigan being a sex and fertility goddess. So that's a thing that goes on definitely within that Christian framework. But also then you have traditional misogyny, that toxic masculinity that would only see the strong female figure as something sexual. So all of that is going on there as well. Maeve suffers from that too. So you've got all of that going on. But anybody who's really looking at the Morrigan or any of her sisters as that kind of mothering role really needs to sit down with themselves if they've been brought up in some kind of Catholic environment, or, they really need to sit down with themselves and just figure that out, because that's not, again, according to the actual Irish mythology, the actual lore of the Morrigan, the stories, along with, I mean, take it or leave it, but that's there, but along with then my own decades of experience of not just my relationship with the Morrigan and my interactions and my communication with the Morrigan, which is daily, but also then all of the people I've guided at the Morrigan's Cave, all of the students that I've taught, which, combined would number in the many thousands at this point, and all of those relationships or experiences that have been communicated with me. The motherly ones are generally traced back to something like this, to be honest. Or, there's situations where it might not be Christian, but it's something that somebody needs in their lives and they're projecting it back onto the Morrigan. And, she's so much more than any of that. So if you need, a nurturing figure, try the Virgin Mary. Morrigan's not it, okay? So understanding these projections really requires this kind of nuanced approach. You need to understand the complexity of the Morrigan, but also the complexity of human psychology, also the complexity of colonial brainwashing when this Christianization process takes over and they are colonizing a particular culture. They really do a great job on implanting all of this deep within the collective psyche of the people that they are Christianizing, right? To recognize both the integrity of the Morrigan within the pre-Christian Irish religious framework and the complex ways in which cultures reinterpret and assimilate deities over time. This is not going to be a perfect process, okay? This is my own take on it. Take it or leave it. I guarantee you that there's some people that I've offended by going through this. Again, sit down with yourself if that's you. Just have a little sit down, maybe journal it out, because really examining why whatever I've said here has been pushing buttons for you is going to give you a lot more clarity than anything I've said in this video, right? That self-examination process is so, so important, especially if you want to be working with the Morrigan. So look, there's a whole playlist on the Morrigan. It's going to show up somewhere here on the screen. Have a look through it. Maybe listen to another video. Really, like if this is your first video with me, really try and kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from with this. I have not just pulled this out of my arse, I promise, right? This is, as I said, decades worth of learning, experience, and integration, right? Which is the 3 pillars of Irish paganism, which you have a whole free resource access to underneath. There's a link below. It's irishpagan.school/3 days. So definitely check that out. There's also links to trustworthy resources. There's actually a year's worth of free content, at least a year. We're pushing 400 videos on this channel alone. We have a podcast, we have a blog, we have a TikTok. We have so many free resources for you. Please take advantage of it. Please educate yourselves. Please try and understand what's going on, whether that's with the Morrigan or with, your general spirituality or your psychological, issues that need to be dealt with, right? And need to be recognized, and the awareness of them needs to be a central factor to your own spiritual practice and process, right? Very important work. So, playlist of the Morrigan. Enjoy. Have a good day. Slán.